Welcome to the Abe Legal Podcast. I'm Talib Kareem, legal director and co-founder. Last week, we talked about some really important distinctions between independent contractors and full employees, particularly those who work in California. This week, we're going to be talking about something else very important, and that has to do with the law of coronavirus. Big scare. Well, hopefully after the podcast, you won't be as afraid if you're a startup or nonprofit leader. In the meantime, let's first talk a little bit about what is Abe. So Abe is an online legal marketplace that helps startup founders and nonprofit leaders get on the phone 24 hours a day with business lawyers to talk through whatever challenges that they are facing, be it needing documents to file in order to actually become incorporated as a business, or agreements between co-founders, or perhaps articles of incorporation, and maybe even financing documents in order to bring into the company venture capital money. Whatever you need in terms of legal help, Abe is available for you to actually get on the phone and speak to a lawyer today. Unlike some of our competitors, we don't just give you a bunch of legal documents and have you go and figure it out by yourself. We actually first put you in contact with lawyers who help you to tailor make whatever documents that are out there for your particular needs. So again, if you need any help with things having to do with the law, go and check us out at abe.legal. One of the things that we like to focus on as a company is that which makes us really unique, and that is our terrific network of lawyers who we call Abe Counsels. And every week we highlight a member of the Abe Counsel network, and this week we're highlighting Damani Ingram. Damani is a terrific lawyer who's been practicing for a significant number of years, but is more than just a lawyer. He's an advisor, he is a counselor, and he's also a black belt in martial arts, so watch out. But beyond that, his specialty is both business law as well as nonprofit law. And along with that, he also helps his clients with estate matters and international business transactions. So if you have any of the issues or you have problem with any of those issues, Damani Ingram is available for you on the Abe platform, along with all the other lawyers that are with us at Abe. So we look forward to you all being able to enjoy Damani's expertise. And again, don't hesitate to go to abe.legal for answers to your legal problems right away. Now, one of the things that I mentioned was our competitors, that we were different. And recently, there were two moves by our competitors that we thought were worthy of noting. One, UpCounsel actually shut its doors as of the time this podcast is being recorded. And another one of our competitors, Atrium, pivoted and shed all of its lawyers. So both of those are noteworthy, and we're going to basically break down what happened in two parts. This episode, will deal with the first company, and that's UpCounsel. So UpCounsel, like Abe, was a legal marketplace that provided both, again, contacts for lawyers that were accessed by people who needed legal help, both companies, nonprofits, and individuals. And so, unfortunately, they forgot about the really special sauce of their platform, which we haven't, and that is the network of lawyers themselves. And so they were they were sued by one of the lawyers on their platform who argued that, in fact, the company was essentially picking winners and losers, that they had an algorithm that ranked some companies unfairly lower than other companies, or some lawyers lower than other lawyers. And so as a result, they were sued, and the claim was so strong that they were forced to enter into a settlement. And the settlement, along with other debts that were facing UpCounsel, caused them to have to sell their assets to LinkedIn, actually, at a price that will actually resulted in the investors who put in at least $26 million having to accept pennies on the dollar for their investment. But at least they got something, right? Along with the creditors. So this is good news for Abe, because in place of UpCounsel, both startups as well as lawyers still have a place to go to, and that's abe.legal. So that's the news of the hour. Now let's talk about the topic of the hour, and that is the law of the coronavirus 19. So before we talk about the law, let's talk about what is coronavirus. As you probably know by now, coronavirus is a respiratory disease that was originated in Wuhan province of China. And it got its name coronavirus 19 because it was found or discovered in the end of 2019. The interesting thing about coronavirus is that it has become quite deadly. Tens of thousands of people apparently have lost their lives. Many others have been infected. And nevertheless, the majority of the people who have contracted the disease, the vast majority, have survived. The mortality rate of this disease is only 3%, so that's relatively good news. Nevertheless, the actual symptoms have been called zombie-like, and so that's why, in many ways, it has caused panic amongst both those who may be directly affected, as well as those who are seeking to avoid being affected by this disease. So another thing that is also scary is that there's no known vaccine, at least at the current moment. So the question is how can you protect yourself as both an individual and a business owner? So from a personal standpoint, one of the things that the Center for Disease Control, as you probably know by now, recommends is that you wash your hands often. You avoid touching your eyes and nose and mouth with unwashed hands. You avoid contact with people who are sick. That's like basically, sensible information. And you also cover your cough or sneeze with a tissue, and you clean and disinfect your hands often, as well as those areas around your workspace. My own also recommendation is that you avoid travel in places that are confined, such as an airplane, particularly for a very long period of time, as well as travel on cruise ships. It's worthy of note that at the beginning of the year, the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which had over 300 Americans and their families, was quarantined because many of the passengers began contracting the coronavirus, and about 300 U.S. citizens were eventually evacuated along with their families, and they were quarantined in a couple of Air Force bases, one in Texas, Lackland, and the other in California. And as a result, only a few of them, as of the time of this podcast, have been released. Talk about an extended vacation. So If you don't want to face any of those challenges, I would avoid that you heed the recommendations that we're going to give to you in this podcast. So in terms of some of the questions that you as a nonprofit leader or an executive at a startup company might be asking yourself is, for example, if you have workers who may have, let's say, attended a business meeting over in China, should you consider quarantining them or having them work remotely from home while they basically, go through a period of time or incubation period? Some consider that to be 14 days to determine whether or not they've contracted the disease. And according to the research that we found, the answer to that question would be yes. You should consider telling them to, telework, which makes great sense, if they can, and if they're actually showing symptoms of the disease. Of course, you may want to consider giving them paid leave if your company allows for that. Now, what can you actually restrict your employees from traveling on their own to China, for example? And you may consider restricting your employees from traveling. You would, again, of course, we know that there is a constitutional right of freedom of movement, but in rare cases, the freedom of movement can be trumped by concerns of widespread epidemic diseases such as the coronavirus. Second of all, does the Family Medical Leave Act, which again requires that employers provide the workers who are employed with them a reasonable period of time to care for themselves or family members who might be affected by the coronavirus? And the answer to that is yes, assuming that that your company actually is bound by the obligations of FMLA. FMLA does not apply to small businesses, so therefore, again, companies that have, for example, 50 or less in terms of employees. So your company, if you're a really small early stage startup, you might not have that as an issue, but if you're a larger company, you may. Another question that was asked is, do you have to pay workers' compensation for employees who contract the coronavirus? And that might be, the answer to that is perhaps. If, for example, your employees contracted this disease while they were, let's say, on company travel, then the requirements of workers' compensation would be applicable. Another question to consider is what are the federal guidelines that that an employee might be required to follow? There are federal guidelines, and the answer is that there are federal guidelines from OSHA, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Administration. There's the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. There's also the American Disabilities Act, which protects employees with disability. There's the World Health Organization, which may be providing guidance to employers, and also the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission also has guidance, and those are a lot, right? And that's the reason why Abe is here, to actually help you as a business owner keep focused on the actual operation of your business and not take your eye off the ball. Allow people who know the law to do that for you, and that's why you can contact Abe and get a lawyer on the phone immediately to assist you with that. So what are some of our takeaways and recommendations? We actually have a few. First of all, create and share a strategy for your employees. For example, emphasize the importance of washing hands and again, staying basically away from those confined areas that we mentioned earlier, such as traveling in airplanes for extended periods or on cruise ships. Second of all, delay or cancel trips to affected regions, such as China, for example, and perhaps attend events instead of in person. Consider attending them remotely, live streaming the events as opposed to traveling in person. Also, consider diversifying your supply chain. If you're getting, for example, goods from China, you may want to really focus on maybe even locally sourced products. If you're manufacturing goods, for example, you might want to consider using 3D printers, for example, to cover your manufacturing needs if possible at this time. And also, you would be well served to host a mandatory training. And all of these steps could be a part of a coronavirus response policy, which is something that Abe can assist you with creating. Again, those are just some of the resources that are available to you as a business owner or nonprofit leader at www.abe.legal. So we hope those resources are helpful to you. And now we want to give you another interesting element and opportunity to enjoy something relating to the business of startups, and that is our weekly discussion of the hit HBO series Silicon Valley. So in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about season 1, episode 3 of Silicon Valley. And in this episode, there's some really interesting developments that you may recall for those who have watched the show, and that is the title is called Articles of Incorporation. And so, first of all, you'll remind yourself that the fictitious company Pied Piper was offered some investment money, and the check for the investment was written in the name of the actual company, Pied Piper Inc. And so therefore, Richard Hendricks, who was a CEO and experience in that role, had to basically form a company and name Pied Piper and get it incorporated. And he chose to incorporate it in California, although if you were to come to Abe, we might recommend that you become a Delaware corporation, and we'll talk about that in a different podcast. But for now, Richard found that there was another company named Pied Piper Incorporated in California. And so he decided to go and meet with the owner of the company and ask him if he would be willing to sell the name Pied Piper Inc. to Richard and his co-founders. And the guy basically had pity on Richard and initially agreed to sell the company to Richard, and they cemented their agreement, which was a verbal agreement, with a handshake. And then there was an article subsequently that came out in a tech blog that somehow this owner, was an older gentleman focusing on landscaping his company, he somehow was forwarded this article about the success of Richard in securing a investment from this billion-dollar venture capitalist named Peter Gregory. And as a result, he began to think that this company, Pied Piper, was actually much larger than he thought. And the agreement to sell the name for just $1,000 he thought was, again, essentially, a ripoff, and that he was being taken advantage of by this wealthy tech executive. And so he came to Richard's house and he saw that, who Richard actually was, and he wasn't actually that wealthy. But the question was, did he have a enforceable agreement? So first, let me encourage you to pause the actual podcast and go to the bottom of your screen into the comment section and give us what you think is the answer to that question. So now that you've given your comment, let me give you the answer. So the first of all is that a verbal agreement, even one that's not written down, for the sale of intellectual property actually may be enforceable, depending upon the state that you find yourself, may be enforceable, even without a writing, and even through a handshake. So again, this is something that Abe.legal can explain in more detail if you get on the phone with one of our lawyers. Another element is to discuss why was it that that he decided to form his company as a corporation as opposed to a limited liability company or a partnership. Well, the easy answer is that the check itself was written out to Pied Piper Incorporated. But beyond that, if there was a, let's just hypothetically speaking, it was just, the check was written out to Pied Piper, what are the benefits of forming the company as a corporation as opposed to a limited liability company or a partnership or limited liability partnership? And the answer to that is that most venture financing professionals, venture capitalists, angels, if you like, they're interested in investing in corporations because of the ability for them to own stock, as opposed to, let's just say, other types of instruments that might be available in a limited liability company, for example, such as equity, that is, demonstrated or that is expressed in other forms other than stock. So again, the stock rights and the stock options are those things that are typically only confined to C corporations as opposed to S corporations. And again, that's another topic for another day. So again, that's another interesting element. And lastly, again, is the question of why is Delaware such an important company? I mentioned that earlier, as opposed to California. And again, there are many startups that have become incorporated in wherever they were formed, but investors like the stability of Delaware as a state. And so Delaware has become the go-to golden standard for companies who are looking to form their companies and secure investment financing, particularly from venture capitalists. So we plan to go into more detail on a later show, but I think that's probably all that you need to know in terms of that particular episode of Silicon Valley. For more, check out Silicon Valley on HBO Now or any other platform that you might have available. We want to end our program by saluting another legend and giant in the law. This time, not a lawyer, but a lawmaker. That's none other than the giant himself, Bernie Sanders. So why are we focusing on Bernie? Well, I want to say that I personally have met and worked with Senator Sanders. While a chief counsel for a member of the United States House of Representatives, who was also a leader of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, my member of Congress, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, worked side by side with Senator Sanders. Senator Sanders, as you know, had been a long-time serving member of the House of Representatives, but in 2006 was elected to the United States Senate. And again, had developed a lot of relationships and helped to actually found the Congressional Progressive Caucus. When he went over to the Senate, he didn't forget about his progressive roots, but in fact, he doubled down on them. And so whenever there were meetings of the Progressive Caucus, and they were the largest caucus in the United States House, there was only a fraction of the House members who would come. But along with those small numbers in the House, there was invariably always going to be Senator Sanders and his staff there at the meetings, particularly during the negotiation over Medicare and Medicaid, and in particular in health reform. As you may know, for those who were around then, the Democrats actually and the progressives wanted a bill that was called Medicare for All, that was actually sponsored by and authored by the late Congressman John Conyers with the support of Senator Sanders. However, the President Obama, he wanted the minimalist approach, a bill that would bring about some improvements, but was minimal enough to get the support of the wealthy, particularly the insurance companies and the doctors and the large healthcare organizations, along with the hospitals on board. And the minimalist approach was the approach that the president believed was the best chance of success, and so that's what he pushed for. It was only by the advocacy of the Progressive Caucus, led by the likes of Senator Sanders, along with other members of Congress, such as Congresswoman Jackson Lee and Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congressman John Conyers and others, that were that were strong enough. Those voices were strong enough to make sure that the Affordable Care Act included progressive provisions, such as, again, requiring that healthcare, that insurance companies cover the family members of those that it insured, even though they had become adults. Some of us understood that 26, which was the cutoff, wasn't long enough, and that a person should be covered for as long as they needed to be covered by their parents' health care plan, for example. We also argued that a person who could not afford to pay for health care should not be taxed, which was another part of the president's bill. But nevertheless, again, through our strong advocacy, there were some provisions that were included, such as hundreds of millions of dollars for community health centers, particularly that was advocated by Congressman Clyburn, who many people know, was not supportive of Senator Sanders, although I wish he had been personally. But nevertheless, we know him personally, and one of the things that beyond that we can say is that he stood up for veterans. Senator Sanders, while the chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, was responsible for landmark legislation that helped to rewrite the law and as it relates to the GI Bill, which was a law that helped millions of veterans to pay for their education and also get loans for their housing. And so, again, that's another strong point. Lastly, one of the things that Senator Sanders has been pushing for is to end the crushing trillion-dollar debt that is on the backs of those who have gone to college, for example. He wants to eliminate that debt and make public education free, which to me is a great idea. We need to have people who don't have the debt that we currently have, and who could, for example, be employed by community organizations and public institutions to keep those organizations strong. And for that reason, I think we should all, again, celebrate Senator Sanders. Senator Sanders is, by definition of Malcolm X, a young person, even though he has a head of gray and was in Congress for probably longer than many of us have been born. But according to Malcolm's definition, you're young so long as you continue to desire for change. Senator Sanders isn't someone who's looking for just incremental or change or messaging that talks about change. He wants fundamental change. He wants to, again, The idea of medical benefits being something that is a basic right of somebody. So long as you're an American and you're living here and paying taxes, you should be able to enjoy that. The idea of education, wanting to have, again, the best workers and the best citizens by making sure that they have access to education. And again, wanting to provide people with an environment free of racism, for example. Those are some of the things that I think warrant Senator Sanders being named our legal legend and giant for this week. So this has been Talib Kareem with Abe. If you need any help with startup documents or nonprofit organization formation documents or legal advice in general, go to abe.legal. Until next week, we bid you farewell.